If you're trying to make any kind of meaningful, effective change in your life, you've come to the right place.
Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to another episode of We're Talking Shift. Today, we are going to get into the business of proper hydration. Amazingly, the majority of information coming from doctors and naturopaths, dietitians, alternative health practitioners, coaches, as well as trainers, well, it's not exactly on the money. What we hear pretty much everywhere from everyone is to just drink a ton of water. But what if I told you that there is plenty of research and evidence that says drinking plain water is not necessarily the most, efficient way to properly hydrate? So we're going to be talking about hydration, the science of electrolytes, and what the truth around optimal sodium intake is. My guest, he's going to clear up a lot of the confusion around this subject. And by the end of this episode, you will know if the way you've always been told to hydrate is actually right and effective. So before we dive in, let me tell you about my guest, Robb Wolf. Robb is a former research biochemist. He's the author of New York Times bestseller, The Paleo Solution, The Original Human Diet, and Wired to Eat. Robb has functioned as a review editor for the Journal of Nutrition and Metabolism. He is the co-founder of the Nutrition and Athletic Training Journal, The Performance Menu, and is co-owner of NorCal Strength and Conditioning, one of Men's Health top 30 gyms in America. He has transformed the lives of hundreds of thousands of people around the world via his top-ranked podcast, his books, and seminars. And he is one of the co-founders of LMNT, a superior electrolyte, I knew I was going to trip over that at some point, drink that I am crazy for. Okay, onward. Robb, welcome to We're Talking Shift.
Loree, huge honor to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. So I discovered LMNT, which for those of you that are listening is LMNT. This product, when a sample arrived with one of my Thrive Market orders like about a year ago, it just came with my order. And I was like, this is really interesting. I looked at the ingredients because most electrolyte drinks are full of crap. And so I was like, this looks good. Let me give this a try. And it was definitely
remember which flavor it was?
It was, I got this citrus package. So it was one of the, I don't remember which, it's probably like either the lemon lime or the orange.
Okay.
But
just curious.
Yeah, I loved all of them. Oh, and by the way, I'm going to digress for just a second here because I'm sitting here drinking my morning fat coffee full of fat, and I put some of the chocolate in here.
Yep.
So it's like a chocolate sweet salty thing because I have some vanilla collagen in there too. And then with my fat,
amazing.
So it's really rich. It's freaking awesome because I was like, I'm not crazy about the chocolate in my water, but I love it in my smoothies and I love it in my fat coffee. So yeah, you guys probably have all kinds of tricks for these drinks, but that's a good one I had to share.
You can go decaf coffee, do either the regular chocolate, or right now we have the our seasonal mint chocolate for the holidays. And then I will get a box out to you because it's limited edition. Once it's gone, it's gone. And then top it off with either some Kahlua or a little bit of peppermint schnapps is amazing.
Get out. All right. New holiday beverage right there. Yeah. Thank you.
Go slow on them. They go down easy. Yeah.
Exactly. All right. So this whole thing, though, it got me thinking about a conversation that I had prior to when I got this sample in the mail with another guest that I've had on, Tommy John. He's kind of a regular, and he was talking about the myths around hydrating by drinking, liters of water every day, and how most people are so misinformed about this. And so I started doing a little digging, and finally I was like, I want to find somebody that's really dialed into this and really an expert on this to talk more thoroughly about it. So I was like, why don't I figure out who you people are? And so anyway, here we are. What I would love to do is start with, I guess your story, and how did you even wind up becoming an expert? How and why did you even start developing this product? What drove you?
It's funny, that expert thing is it's a double-edged sword. So I'm a biochemist by training, was looking at either doing a MD track, a PhD track, or maybe an MD PhD track. And right around that time, I had a pretty life-altering health crisis. I developed ulcerative colitis so bad that I nearly died from it. I'm about 170 pounds right now. At the low ebb of my ulcerative colitis, I was about 125, 130 pounds. So if you imagine like 50 pounds less of me, like I was in pretty rough shape. And it was a host of things. I figured out I had celiac disease, which is a gluten intolerant, autoimmune disease, and I had some other stuff going on. But the long and short, I just kind of genetically, or the way the cards were dealt to me, I don't do super well with carbs. I don't do well with grains. There's a lot of foods that I don't do well with. And it was around 1998 that in an attempt to deal with all these health issues, I was just researching this idea of a paleo or low carb type diet got on my radar. And I started researching that, and eventually went and did a research fellowship with Loren Cordain. He's kind of the guy credited with founding the paleo diet concept, at least in modern times. And it was not long after that I ran across this kind of wacky workout online called CrossFit. And I went on to co-found the first and fourth CrossFit affiliate gyms in the world. And I think that you're going to have a little call out about a life-altering event at some point in this. So I'll circle back to that thing.
Cool. Okay.
So so I've been researching and talking about low carb, paleo, ketogenic diets for 23 years. I'm a decent biochemist. I understand all the metabolic pathways and all that stuff. But I've oftentimes struggled fueling my passion, which is Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, with this low carb diet. Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is a very intense activity. It's basically wrestling, wearing pajamas, and cognitively, I feel really good on a low carb diet. But then some of the physical performance stuff that I do, I just didn't have that low gear that I would like to have. And so about 5 years ago, I ran across a couple of guys, Tyler Cartwright and Luis Villasenor, who have an online platform called Keto Gains. And these guys just do these amazing body transformation stories with people, and they have hundreds of thousands of people in their communities, and they use an appropriate protein, lower carb diet to affect this body transformation stuff. And I also noticed that a good number of people in their community were doing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu at a high level. And I was kind of like, man, I wonder what they are doing that I'm not doing. So I kind of stalked Tyler and Luis and eventually became friends with them and had them look at what I was doing. And there's kind of a whole long story around that. But the long and short was that they are coaches of this stuff, and they also understand the science at a very high level, but they work with people every day and have for years. And what they figured out is that people on lower carb diets, and really not just low carb diets, but when people are eating minimally processed food, you need to add a significant amount of sodium to your diet. Everybody gets generally too much sodium because they're eating highly processed, kind of low quality foods.
Right.
So Tyler and Luis told me, you need to up your electrolytes, specifically sodium. And it took me a good year to listen to them, because when one is an expert in one area, of course you are too thick-headed to listen to people who are experts in other areas. But when I eventually did, it was just this amazing transformation. Like all of the niggling additional like health and sleep problems that I had really resolved pretty remarkably. And I looked out at the community that I've been serving, and I was like, oh my goodness, like all of the problems that people experience on these kind of lower carb diets are electrolyte driven. So we ended up developing a how to make it yourself homebrew downloadable guide. We called it Keto Aid, and it was this much table salt, this much potassium chloride, this much magnesium, lemon juice, stevia, water, shake it up and go, because we just wanted people to get this problem addressed, And within 6 months, we had like 500,000 downloads of this guide, and the folks that were using it were just like, oh my goodness, this is so powerful. It has fixed all these problems. My only complaint is that when I travel, I'm traveling with 3 bags of non-labeled white powder, and that's kind of a problem.
It could be suspicious.
TSA takes a dim view of stuff like that. So would you guys consider making some sort of a convenience type drink? So 5 years ago, I was not remotely thinking about becoming an electrolyte mogul. Like, it wasn't remotely on my radar. I would have thought that that would be the most ridiculous area for me to put focus. But what we found was this huge need hidden in plain sight. And then we addressed the problem initially with a freemium offering. Like, we weren't charging for it. We weren't even using it as an email lead magnet. It was just like, here, use this thing. And then we found this group of folks that were really desperately in need of better electrolyte management. And they kind of convinced us to do a product. And 3 years later, I think LMNT is one of the fastest growing health and wellness companies at this point. Like, it's just going
Amazing.
like crazy. Yeah. So that was probably a lot longer than what you were searching for a Genesis story, but there's a few twists and turns to the whole thing. Yeah.
No, totally. So I love that. And you're right. I mean, you wouldn't have known, I guess, that there was such a gaping hole in this space until, you were, which seems like a lot of people, when they have a personal issue, that's when we get some new information. When somebody finally goes, nothing is working, I'm going to have to figure this out on my own. What do I have to do? Who do I have to, talk to, research? What do I have to invent? And then we get, the next level. So thank you for doing that.
Sure.
But so let's talk about like some explanations around hydrating, electrolytes, the role of water, and then we'll kind of move into like symptoms, fixes, how to recognize imbalances, all that kind of thing. How does that sound?
Right. Sure.
So biggest myths, first of all, which, we've already alluded to. What is the biggest myth around hydrating that people don't understand?
Man, I don't know if there's two probably.
Okay.
And one is that, we need to consume X number of fluid ounces, per day. And then the second is probably that sodium intake is broadly and generally deleterious to health. And so it's funny because it's kind of talking to kids about this is far easier than adults because they come with so much less baggage. You just kind of lay some of the stuff out and they're like, oh yeah, that makes complete sense, but it's been a good 30 years, I think, that we've received this message of drink 8-ounce glasses of water per day. And there's really no good science from where this came as kind of a beginning point. But if we back up just a little bit more, if we look in a textbook of medical physiology and we look up the topic hydration is defined as the water that is in our person, but also the electrolytes, and the two are inseparable. And then somewhere along the line, this idea that hydration was just water really came into prominence. And that combined with the recommendation to consume, 64 ounces of fluid per day, or, more than that, doesn't matter the temperature, doesn't matter how large or small you are, doesn't matter what electrolytes you're getting in your diet, just by hook or by crook, do that. And it's interesting, it was around this time that endurance athletics really became super popular. When I was a kid, marathoning was still this kind of weirdo fringe thing. And then I was maybe a teenager and like you started hearing about like the Ironman triathlons. It's like, well, these people not only run a marathon, they ride 100 miles and they swim 3 miles or, whatever the distances are. And so that stuff started ramping up, and it was in lockstep with this recommendation to like hydrate, but hydrate with no understanding of what that actually means. It just was water. Yeah. And we started experiencing this phenomenon in which people would die during a marathon. People would die during a prolonged endurance event or military boot camp, football double days. This had never really happened in history before. And what people were doing was consuming so much water and also sweating that when we sweat, we lose water, but we lose a remarkable amount of sodium. And especially certain people that we call super sweaters can have like a doubling or tripling of the amount of sodium that they lose in their sweat. And we work with some NFL teams and some of these larger,
Yeah.
pretty muscular guys, they will lose 10 pounds of water and 10 grams of sodium. That's 20 teaspoons of sodium in the
That's
course of
huge.
a hard practice or a game. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. And so if you have that as the reality that we tend to lose lots of sodium, particularly if we're active, if we're in a warm or a high altitude, cold environment, both of those can be problematic. But if that's our reality, and then what we're told is consume very little sodium and drink lots of water, it gets us into the spot that's called hyponatremia, where our blood sodium is super low. And every muscle contraction, nerve impulse, all of the energy that is generated in our body, this thing called the Krebs cycle, is driven by sodium potassium pumps. And other than pH, probably the most tightly regulated physiological function in our body is electrolyte status. And if pH goes up or down a little bit too much, we can get sick or die. And if electrolytes go up a little bit too much up or down, we can get sick or die. So it's a really important thing to properly regulate.
Wow. So let's talk a second about dehydration. When somebody thinks that they're dehydrated, you hear like, oh, if you feel like you're really thirsty and dehydrated, it's too late. You're already dehydrated. You've already been dehydrated now for a certain amount of time. So then they go, you just need to drink a lot of water. So can you be dehydrated without actually realizing you're dehydrated?
I guess one could, so this is an interesting thing. Elite runners, like elite marathoners in particular, part of what makes them elite is they either genetically or through training get to a spot where they can lose about 5% of their body weight and still perform at a very high level. So technically they are dehydrated, but really what's happening if let's say the person weighs 150 pounds, they could be 7 pounds lighter from lost water weight while still performing well, which is like a miracle for,
Wow.
weight to power ratio. So that person is technically dehydrated, but they're performing at a super high clip. And so here's another interesting aside. When one digs into the literature on how many people have died from dehydration, other than like, they got lost in the desert, they got trapped in a mine cave in, it's zero. People do now. If there's vomiting, if somebody has extreme diarrhea, like they catch cholera or something, these are completely different things. But an individual left to their own devices, there is zero documented cases over like the last 40 years of somebody just sitting there like, well, I'm so dehydrated now that I'm going to die. Wow. Whereas there are thousands of cases of people overhydrating and dying from hyponatremia. So
that's interesting. I had not heard about that. So literally dying from drinking too much water.
Correct. And, this happens frequently within, say, like sorority and fraternity hazing, where they will make people drink either water or beer or something like that. And one of the above and beyond the alcohol is just so depleting sodium levels that they end up in cardiac arrhythmias and brain swelling and can die. So, this is, in this, not to, drive this off a cliff, but in this age of COVID and trying to figure out risk analysis, this has been a long-standing risk analysis, and it is far more risky to overconsume water than it is to underconsume water, because you will get thirsty to a point where you will literally murder someone to obtain something to drink, whereas people can just be, goaded into continuing to drink water or a too low in electrolyte, content beverage, and they can overconsume it to the point that they get sick or die. And this is on the drinkelement.com website. We have a lot of this science, and it's part of how we kind of back into the recommendations that we make for consumption. Yeah.
So interesting, because too, you see so many unhealthy people. Visually, you can tell when somebody's not a healthy person, usually. And there's never a jug of water not attached to their hands. If you've got a phone in one hand and water in the other hand, and
right.
You're just like, how much good is that actually doing them? Is there something else that they should be focusing on other than making sure they get, 5 gallons of water down them every day? But let's talk a little bit you've touched on it already, but let's define electrolytes one more time for people, because a lot of people know the word, but they don't actually know what comprises in electrolytes and how, why that is just so critically important. Let's just make sure, talk to us like, the kids, crayons and stick figures, so people really get that. Yeah.
Yeah. From a chemistry perspective, electrolytes are charged particles. They're what we call ions. And salt water is kind of maybe one of the most accessible, everybody has experienced salt water, even in the ocean or gargling or, something like that. And so it's got a sodium ion and a chloride ion, and one is positively charged, one is negatively charged. The things that we're usually familiar with regards to electrolytes are sodium, potassium, magnesium, to some degree calcium, and then the other side of that is chloride, bicarbonate, and phosphate. But those they're important, but they, the metal ions, the sodium, potassium, magnesium are probably the really most important ones. Magnesium and calcium are important for muscle contraction and relaxation. Magnesium is important for that Krebs cycle, ATP cycle, where we generate energy for everything that we do. But they're all kind of secondary. Really, the workhorses for electrolytes are sodium and potassium because of their role in the sodium potassium pump. And what we find is that people kind of fall into one of two camps, really. One is that they're eating a pretty westernized processed diet, and they get lots of sodium because that is a major, constituent of processed foods. Or we have people that are kind of over in what we might call this whole food world. And this would be vegan or paleo or like well-composed ketogenic diet, macrobiotics, Mediterranean. Mm-hmm. But people are eating largely whole, minimally processed foods. And that means by, definition that it doesn't have a lot of sodium in it. Natural foods don't really have a ton of sodium in it. And so there are a lot of health concerns clearly around eating too much processed food. Hypertension is a big one. And sodium is definitely related to hypertension, high blood pressure. Sodium plays a role in that story. But what we find when we look at the literature is that people who have hypertension, who are placed on a low sodium diet, their blood pressure doesn't really improve. It might improve a little bit, but it's a very nominal shift, because the real cause is that these folks have chronically elevated insulin levels. And most people are familiar with insulin from managing diabetes and things like that. And insulin just does a zillion different things in the body. But one of the things that it does is it helps to regulate fluid balance. Insulin also manages a hormone called aldosterone, and aldosterone is produced by the kidneys, effectively the adrenal glands, and it causes us to retain sodium. There are other hormones that help to hold on to sodium also. When you may think, well, why does the body do that? Well, if we don't do that to some degree, and people have probably experienced this, if you have too low of blood pressure, you go from seated to standing, and the person can get lightheaded or even pass out. There's a condition called POTS, Postural Orthostatic Tachycardia syndrome, and it mainly affects kids, but it can affect adults. And these kids are at high risk for traumatic brain injury from head injury because they have a tendency of passing out when they stand. And one of the main treatments that they provide to these kids is adequate sodium intake. So it's kind of about finding the right balance in all this. But what we find is when folks shift to a minimally processed, mainly whole food diet, they really benefit from dramatically increasing their sodium intake for the most part, particularly if they are not insulin resistant, not hypertensive, all that kind of stuff.
So I want to make sure, because hypertension is such a huge thing. It's, a huge disease condition. And so normally what a person that is suffering from that is told is, here's your prescription, eat a low sodium diet, but not but that's about it. Here's your pills.
Yeah.
Cut down on the
Yeah.
salt. But nobody usually says anything about, and you should probably do X, Y, and Z, which is like, your electrolyte intake, because that would be counter to what they're saying
Yep.
you should do. And nobody's addressing the insulin and too much sugar and other toxic shit in their diet, right?
Right.
So
Right.
interesting. So
Well,
everybody that
and this is something even back beyond the days of Atkins. People recognized that when they went on a low carb diet, they lost a bunch of water. It's the whoosh effect, or they're like, oh, I'm peeing like crazy for like 3 days. And it's kind of dismissed, but what they're peeing away is their cardiovascular risk, profile, because they're going from hypertensive to normotensive. And the flip side of that is that because they're in this low carbohydrate state, there's a process called the natriuresis of fasting. It means the loss of sodium while fasting. You need to, if you're eating a low carb diet or doing a pretty aggressive intermittent fasting, you really need to add more sodium, or you will feel awful during this process. But along the way there, let's say you are overweight and maybe insulin resistant, doing a low carb diet or doing some fasting, you will notice that you start peeing like crazy because your body is normalizing, and it's going from hypertensive, high blood pressure, to normotensive. And that's then when we need to add in a little bit more sodium and get smart about managing the electrolytes better at that new set point.
Interesting. So just to clarify for listeners, are salt and sodium the same thing? Because usually
Yes. Yeah. Well,
okay,
I mean, when
same
you get
thing.
into chemistry geek stuff, a salt is any like ionic bonded chemical. But yeah, for like common stuff, when we say salt and sodium, they're used interchangeably within nutrition circles. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Because you look at the back of the label of food products, and it always gives you the sodium levels, right?
Yeah.
But it never says the word salt. But
Right.
but when we talk about it, we talk about it as salt. So I just want to clear that up for listeners that
You'll see.
essentially for our
Yeah. Yeah. And you will see salt in the ingredient list, and then sodium in the nutrition facts panel. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So I want to, clear that up, that essentially for our purposes, we're talking about the same thing here.
Yes.
But
Yeah.
for the average bear. Okay. All right. So we're talking about let's talk a little bit more about like symptoms and fixes of these imbalances. So how does a person know? What are the obvious signs or symptoms if you are low on electrolytes?
Yeah, and I spent the better part of 20 years in this low spot, which absolutely crushes me. I could have been something when I grew up if I had known this better or early on, but
but you're still something. But you're still something.
I am, but man, there was 20 years of suboptimal. Like the low carb diet really addressed my blood sugar issues. It really addressed my gut issues. But there was this underlying like energy production, exercise capacity that, man, I wish I could get those back. But lethargy, brain fog. So I don't handle carbohydrates super well. But for 15 years, I thought that a lot of the kind of ups and downs that I would feel in the afternoon were blood sugar. But then a couple of years ago, I wore something called a CGM, a continuous blood glucose monitor. And my blood sugar was rock solid. It didn't go up, it didn't go down, but I felt like garbage. And I'm like, well, what on earth is going on? And it was low electrolytes. So this was me slowly backing into this stuff. And well, okay, here's a piece of data, there's a piece of data, but lethargy, brain fog, fatigue, elevated heart rate, problems sleeping, and then ultimately cramping. But when people get to the point that they're cramping, they really are at that spot where their electrolytes are pretty far out of whack. Like that's when I'm at jujitsu and I get a cramp in my toe or something, I'm like, oh, I'm really behind the curve on this. Yeah.
That's good to know, because occasionally I'll get like these weird cramps in my feet. And I'm like, what is going on here? Why is that happening? So that would be my cue that maybe I'm a little bit low on my electrolytes.
Yeah. And it's interesting. People will think a lot about potassium. They'll think a lot about magnesium. But if we don't get adequate sodium, what the body will do is just bleed off the potassium and magnesium and water to try to reestablish the sodium to potassium ratio, because we must have more sodium outside of cells and more potassium inside of cells. It's kind of like the way a hydroelectric dam would work. You need a potential between the two. Really, what it is a battery, but you need these two potentials going on there. And if we don't have that, we will die, ultimately.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
so people focus on potassium, they focus on magnesium. We absolutely need those things. We don't get enough of them with our highly processed diet. But if we get adequate sodium, the kidneys are set up in such a way that they will sort out how much magnesium, how much potassium we need, and we'll be okay. It is much more dangerous to overdo potassium than it is to overdo sodium. Like the margin of error there is rather narrow, and this is part of the reason why potassium as a supplement has an upper limit on it, because people can get cardiac arrhythmias and can die from a very large potassium bolus. Just to make this a little bit dark and morbid, lethal injections are a super concentrated potassium, and it causes the heart to cramp, and that's it. Yeah.
Wow.
So
it seems painful.
Yeah, it's a whole other thing. But it's just, for context, like in the natural world, sodium is kind of hard to find. And of all of the nutrients that we consume, vitamins, minerals, the only thing that we have a specific taste for is sodium, is salt. And, we have sweet, salty, sour, umami as our palate experience.
Yeah.
Salt is an important one. It's a critical nutrient. We will die without it. We'll die without a bunch of the other nutrients too.
Right.
But it really is critically important. And the signs and symptoms of inadequate electrolyte levels, when we look around at the issues that plague people, particularly ironically when people improve their diet, like they feel like garbage when it's like a hangover, and so much of what makes a hangover terrible is dehydration. It causes you to lose both fluid and electrolytes. And so dietary change is such a big ask, because we're changing our personal habits. We're oftentimes ostracizing ourselves from our peer group and our families because we're doing something different. There's all kinds of drama with that. And now, as if that were not enough, let's add in that you feel like absolute garbage, that you're just a shade off of like a debilitating hangover, and we want people to like ride this process out. But ironically, getting adequate sodium in that story can really, really improve the process and help people get to a normal baseline at some point.
Yeah. No, that's so good to know. We're very extremely low carb, my husband and I, and we have been for many, many, many years. But I didn't realize, until over this last year that I've been starting to dive into this and learn about it, that was a big gaping hole. So if you eat healthy, you eat a lot of, greens and produce and, clean meat and whatever. And, you're missing some important elements there, which, elements. Did you see how I did that?
Yeah. That's how we came up with the name.
Well, brilliant. There you go.
Yeah.
I'm kind of proud of myself now that just came pouring out. Wasn't planned.
Literally, we were in this like corporate America, like whiteboard session. And I just noticed that people had said elements 30 times in the last like 15 minutes. I'm like, there's our name. And I just went up and wrote element on the whiteboard. And we're like, okay, next thing.
Yeah. No, that's perfect. And I like the way that, you did it with just LMNT.
Yeah.
When I first got it, I was like, LMNT, I don't get this. And then it took me a minute. I was like, oh, duh, element. It's so brilliant.
Well, and it's a great way of seeing who is the new in crowd versus the old guard, how it gets,
I love it. I love it. But that is good to know, though, for people that have either already been on what we would call a very, very healthy diet, which typically is not anything to do with the standard American diet. I mean, you're not eating processed food and or any kind of what we would consider junk food is like a very rare occasion type of
Mhm.
thing. But if you're not really savvy about this, you still got some up leveling to do in order to
Yes.
really maintain your optimal health. And then for newbies that are just trying to really get into a new eating lifestyle and leave the old trashy one behind, this is again something that they really need to be aware of, especially in that gap where they're sort of, what's the word I'm looking for, when when you're really addicted to something, because the standard American diet full
Yeah.
of fat, salt, bad fat, salt, and sugar is so addictive. So then there's
Yeah.
like this withdrawal period, right? So I would imagine during that withdrawal period, while you're transitioning into something healthier, making sure you're supplementing with this will definitely help bridge that gap a little more comfortably
Yeah.
than you were just sitting there chugging away on your plain water, which makes me wonder about people that swear by their like 3-day water fast. So I wonder, is that really a good idea, or is there a better way to do that?
I would just do pickle juice or a tablespoon of water per gallon of water that one consumes. You will just feel so much better. And
Okay.
clearly, like I think Element is a perfect
Yeah.
addition to that. But like we still have that free downloadable make it yourself guide.
Okay.
Folks go to drinkelement.com/homebrew, and it's a free guide. Like fasting is kind of challenging enough, and I think that the
Yeah.
water only stuff, because people will start losing huge amounts of sodium, your
Mm-hmm.
energy is going to be so much lower, your sleep will be worse. Like just we know sleep is so damn important, and then whenever somebody does something that negatively impacts sleep, I'm just like, I don't know if the trade-off is there. Like if it's
Mm-hmm.
running out of your house because it's burning down, yes.
Sure.
Short of that, like it's really hard to justify anything that disorders sleep. And just about to a person, what people report when they are fasting without adequate electrolytes is that their sleep is terrible. So not
Mm.
only and they're supposed to be doing this for like autophagy and suppressing cancer potential and all this type of stuff. And man,
Yeah.
sleep is like it is the biggest return on investment,
Right.
and arguably more important than our food in a lot of ways. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think you're right in so many ways. The damage caused by consistent poor sleeping habits, or inability to sleep, is it's astronomical, and people don't realize it. They
Right.
keep thinking, well, I'll just get up, I'll slam down my coffee, I'll get my caffeine, or God forbid, even worse, my colas, or my
Right.
monster drinks, or all of that garbage, so that they can get through the day. And then they have a horrible breakfast, because they think that's the most important meal of the day. And then they have a horrible lunch, and then they hit the wall about 2:30, right? And then the cycle just goes on and on.
Right.
Interesting. uh and I really wanted to drive home the point too about brain function. So because that's such an important thing, and your ability and capacity to be able to focus and to think clearly and to react and respond. And most people are, so many people, I shouldn't say most, I don't know what the stats are, but if you're moving at all in any social circles or through society, or are around people during the day, at your job, that there's a lot of there's a lot being left on the table there.
Right.
And
Right.
right. And so I think, I just think that's another thing. It's not just that you want to make sure that you have energy. That's of course a good thing to want, and we need to have that. But it's also about making sure that your brain is functioning at capacity. And this is clearly such an important aspect of that, because just plain water, again, probably is not going to do it.
It can, if you are consuming adequate sodium, magnesium, potassium from the diet. And so
Okay.
part of our download guide helps educate people about good sodium rich food. So like 10 olives provides a gram of sodium. A good sized pickle provides a gram of sodium.
Okay.
Salami, sardines, anchovies, like there are some good sodium rich foods, salted
Okay.
nuts. So it depends. So when we look at this, we're really trying to consider both the dietary inputs and then anything like element that would be supplemental to that. So it's not impossible to get it
Okay.
from dietary sources, but folks have to really stack the deck in their favor to make that work.
Okay, so that was, I'm glad you brought that up because that was one of the things that I asked you was, what about food choices? Are
Yep.
there some foods like you just mentioned that are higher in sodium or potassium or all the combination of things that we
Right.
want? And then what about beverages? Like I always heard that coconut water is naturally high in electrolytes. Is that a good
It
beverage?
has a fair amount of potassium. And so, I
Okay.
mean, it's kind of ticking that potassium box, but if I had, depending on what one's needs were at the moment, but I think that coconut water would be much better powered if one, you've got like a 32 ounce,
Mhm.
container of it or what have you. Maybe a teaspoon of regular salt thrown in there
Okay.
and then shaken up half to a full teaspoon. And then you're going to have a little bit of magnesium, a decent amount of potassium, and then you will have adequate sodium on
Okay.
that. And this is man, this is the easiest stuff in the world to just experiment. Like if somebody has been serially consuming coconut water, say post workout or something,
Hmm.
add some sodium to it and now see how you feel, what's your energy like, and really what's your sleep like that night. Like if we're
Hmm.
really doing something good, we should see an improvement in sleep also.
Interesting. That's a good idea. That's good to know. So add some sodium to the coconut water, or like
Yep.
you said earlier, add a tablespoon to your gallon of water. Add a
Yep.
tablespoon of salt. Okay. Um, okay. So what about like drinking water? Okay. So here, it's really dry where I am. We're in
Right.
Wyoming, so it's very very dry, especially this time of year. So, of course, you wake up a couple times during the night because you're parched. So
Yep.
you take a couple sips of water, you go back to sleep. So is it a even better idea to have a glass of electrolyte water before you go to bed?
Yeah, and it's important to remember that what brings water into the body are the electrolytes. The water follows these charged ions, the
Okay.
sodium, the potassium, and whatnot. Absent that, the water goes into our system, dilutes our electrolytes, and then our kidneys need to work to then reestablish a
Okay.
balance. And so we're actually going to move more water out of the system in that scenario. And this is again something that you live on the backside of any mountain range and you experience really cold or very dry air, or more northern areas where it
Mhm.
never gets above freezing for like a couple of months and the air is just super dry. Folks are used to how their mucous membranes feel when they're doing things regularly. Try doing more electrolytes like what we're laying out here and track that for a week. And you tell me, like, are the
Mhm.
mucous membranes better? Do you wake up less with like those kind of crusty,
Yeah.
weird things growing in your sinus cavity? And is your energy level better? Yeah.
Right.
And I think folks will notice that just uniformly. Yeah.
Hmm. Okay. All right. What about okay, so is there, I mean, I'm guessing maybe it varies a little bit from person to person for, depending on circumstances, but is there like what should we go for how much, how do you know how much to
Yeah.
take in?
That is unfortunately one of the most difficult questions to answer, because do we
Yeah.
have like a 115-pound female or a 240-pound male? Are they doing
Right.
Brazilian jiu-jitsu wearing a gi? When my wife and I go to Costa Rica, or when we used to do this thing called traveling, and we did some
Yeah.
stuff like that, we would do a jiu-jitsu camp where there were 2 3-hour sessions. It was in a metal building that was open air, so you got some wind blowing through, but it was 94, 95 degrees, 90% humidity.
Mm.
And man, on those days, my total sodium needs are maybe like 15 grams per day. And then when I'm living in Montana and let's say I have a day off, my total sodium needs are probably 5 grams a day. So
Okay.
we tend to bracket it. We think that virtually anybody would be well served from getting at least 5 grams of sodium from all sources per
Okay.
day. And then depending on your physical activity the heat, the humidity, cold environments are challenging to deal with because our thirst receptors tend to downregulate. We don't want to drink fluid.
Right.
And so we can end up both dehydrated, but also deficient in electrolytes under both those circumstances in the cold. And then you don't have adequate blood volume, so you don't keep your extremities warm. Part of the problem that people have, because it's a heat pump. You're pumping heat from the core of your body to your periphery. And if you have low blood volume, you don't move heat efficiently. So if people have cold hands and feet,
that's
addressing
me.
electrolytes is a big deal. Yeah. I mean, that's not the whole story, but I guarantee you people will notice an improvement if they improve that stuff. So yeah.
All right. I think I'm still not getting enough then, because chronically cold hands and feet. My hands, they're cold right now. and I'm sitting here drinking my electrolyte water.
Right. So I would say a minimum of 5 grams per day is for just about everybody. If somebody is hypertensive and insulin resistant, they don't typically need more sodium. What they really need is some sort of a lower glycemic load diet. And it doesn't matter if it's paleo or vegan or keto or whatever, they just need to shift towards a whole food diet. And then when they shift, they probably will need additional sodium. But the challenging part above and beyond that is we could see sodium needs double or triple for an individual, depending on the environment that they're in and all that type of stuff. The American Council of Sports Medicine recommends for athletes in warm environments somewhere between 7 and 10 grams of sodium per day. And you have to overlay this with what mainstream medicine tells us, which is to get less than 2 grams of sodium per day. So you may be losing 10. They're telling you to only replace 2. If we ran our bank account like that, we would be in dire straits really quickly, Yeah.
Okay. Really? Oh my God. That's a huge discrepancy there.
It's a massive discrepancy.
Really misleading.
Yeah.
Okay. So I have to just ask, because I personally want to know, what would be a good experiment for somebody that runs a marathon? And I ask that because my daughter usually runs one marathon in LA, somewhere in California every year. And so she's a teeny tiny little thing too. And electrolytes is something that hasn't come up. So if somebody's preparing for a marathon, besides just what they should normally be doing on a daily basis, is there anything extra they should do, like right before? Should they be doing this during the run? For sure after.
For sure after, probably before and during. So, I mean, ideally what we would see is every 32 ounces of water would have the equivalent of 1 element stick pack in it. So a gram of sodium, 200 milligrams potassium, 60 milligrams of magnesium. I think that's a great place to be during her training, during the event. She may need, if it's a cool overcast day, she's going to need less. If it ends up like kind of a weird inversion layer and it's humid and it's hot, then she may need double what she would otherwise anticipate. But I definitely wouldn't do it brand new on game day. I would test this stuff out, we use a very, very absorbable form of magnesium malate, and we use a very small amount. But for some people, any amount of magnesium kind of gives them the disaster pants effect.
So, she's heard of that, but she's never experienced it. Thank God. She's very careful about that.
And you don't. Marathon day is not the day that you want to test something new that could give you disaster pants.
Right. So in the couple months leading up, when you start really your serious training and you're running 8 miles and 10 miles and 12 miles, that would be the good time to start.
Absolutely.
Playing with this. So ultimately, maybe they'll like 1 element packet. That's like one of these, you guys, 0.21 ounce packet per, what did you say? 10 ounces of water per
32 ounces.
32 ounces of water.
That's, I think, a very good place to start. My wife drinks them as concentrated as 16 ounces. I find them undrinkable like that. But she's Italian, so she's tougher than I am. So I don't know, but I think 24 to 32 ounces is really a good sweet spot. And I tend to err more on the 32 ounce side. Yeah.
Okay, that's cool. That's good advice. I'm going to pass that on to her. Thank you. Um, do oh, um, do you have a going rogue story for me?
I kind of do. Yeah. And I alluded to a little bit, and it's maybe
Yeah.
a two-part going rogue.
Okay.
I was in queue to do either an MD track, a PhD track. I had jumped all the hoops, undergrad, MCAT, was working in a cancer research facility, both because I was interested, but also, it's a great resume builder for trying to go into that stuff. And because of my own health crisis and what I figured out to address it, I had run the full gamut of healthcare. Like I was at the University of Washington. It is literally the best medical professionals you could find on the planet. It's a research institution. It's one of the best in the world. These people are brilliant, and nobody could help me. Nobody could help me with this ulcerative colitis. And that's not true. They saved my life when I was in the acute phase and I was going to die. The emergency medicine did its trick. And I think emergency medicine is absolutely miraculous. If you get hit by a bus, you get shot, like
Yeah.
the stuff
Injured.
these people
Yeah.
can do. Yeah, it is amazing. But when you're dealing with a chronic degenerative disease, but modern medicine has almost nothing to offer in those circles. I was facing either a bowel resection or immunosuppressant drugs the rest of my life. And I knew enough about both processes that I didn't want to do it. And so when I was able to fortunately regain my health with this kind of ancestral way of eating, and I became aware of circadian biology and the gut microbiome and everything, I was kind of looking at another 8 to 12 years of studying disease before I started helping people. And then the main tools that I had to help people weren't useful, in my opinion. And it was right around this time I was poking around on the internet and I found this kind of weird workout online called CrossFit. And my good friend, Dave Warner, who's a retired Navy SEAL, he and I started doing CrossFit in his garage. We took all of his welding material out and, put bumpers and rings and everything in there. And I'd say within like 3 months, we had a good 10, 15 people training with us. And I reached out to the Glassmans, Greg and Lauren Glassman, who had founded CrossFit. They said, "Hey, we want to open a gym. We want to call it CrossFit. Can we do that?" And they were like, "Yes, go be Achieve." And so I completely abandoned this becoming a physician, becoming a researcher, and I basically opened a gym and became a coach. And so
did people around you which is super cool, but did your like friends and family go, you're nuts, you all of this time
they didn't
that
even
you've
say
invested?
anything. They just wrote me off. Like it was like,
Really?
this is the done, because I was the first person in my family at that point, I think, ever to have gone to college at all, to say nothing of, potentially getting an MD or a PhD or both of them. And so it was it was really that was a massive pivot. And I tell you what, it was a slog. If one is very security focused, doing academia or medicine is kind of great, because it's like you just have these hoops to jump through. You jump through this hoop and here's your next thing. You jump through this hoop, it's your next thing. And there's a lot to figure out, but it is, being an entrepreneur is so completely different, because you could work 1,000 hours on something and not make $1, or you could put 5 hours into something and make $1 million. I mean,
Right.
there's completely nonlinear, and having this, a dollar paid for an hour worked mentality will kill you. And it's not the right thing for all people. It's not the right thing for all circumstances. I didn't have kids. I wasn't married yet at that point when I did that. I met my wife not long after this, and she was foolish enough to jump in and help me with everything that I've done. But it was the first 2 years of opening the gym, my wife and I together, our tax return, we earned less than $10,000 total between the two of us running that gym the first 2 years. We were working part-time at a physical therapy clinic, and we had 2 cars that were complete junk, but they didn't break during that time. We had an apartment that was like $400 a month, and we just ground on it. But not many people at the age of like 30, 31 are going to be willing to take that
risk.
risk. I mean, it was pretty dire. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, not everybody is cut out for a risk, uncertainty, and going against the status quo, going against what's expected of them from their family. That's it takes some, it takes some massive courage to go against all of those things, kind of go rogue, as
Yep.
I like to
Yep.
say, and just take a hard left and do this other, what seems like maybe crazy thing. But how do you feel about it? Fast forward to what, how is that, how has that played out in your life? I mean, I doubt you've ever had any regrets.
No, no, no. There's never been a day that I wished that I had MD behind my name. And even in the online battles, I sometimes, engage in, just being this punk kid with a bachelor's degree from a state school. And I know the science better than folks with, PhDs and MDs from Harvard, and I can talk them in circles. I really take
Yeah.
seriously being good at what it is that I do.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, the 12 years I spent helping people would have still been invested in just becoming a, a new doctor, good another at least 8. So I was already well on my way to, having, I think the old podcast I had ended up with 38 million downloads total before I shut that one down. And, I innumerable, emails sent, hey, your work saved my life, your work probably saved our daughter, and stuff like that. And so I think I probably, was able to help an order, many orders of magnitude more people not doing that main track. And I guess
Yeah.
one thing that's interesting, like I was raised pretty poor, like we were growing up for white male in America and everything. We were pretty poor. Like we were on like the government food
Mm-hmm.
needle and all that type of
Assistance, yeah.
stuff. Yeah. And so in some ways also I didn't have that far to fall. Like I had worked since I was 16. I started working at 16
Mm-hmm.
because my dad was disabled. My mom had a ton of health issues and was effectively disabled herself. So I had to start supplementing their baseline for them to be able to make it. And so for me, in some ways too, is like I I I can't fall that far, like I've already
Right.
been there, and the fact I have a degree now and I could work in a variety of different places, if this business thing does fail,
Yeah.
that would be challenging. Now I have 7 and 9-year-old daughters. I have a wife. I'm going to be 50 years old next month. And it would be way more difficult for me to do a pivot. Like I've been thinking about a pivot, just like closing all of my online stuff or like really dialing it down and mainly doing like a regenerative farm. And I may do that, but that isn't really going to expose us to financial risk. I'm not doing something that I'm not taking everything that we've ever earned and leveraging it into this new startup
Right.
and,
Yeah.
rolling the dice on that. I think it'd
Yeah.
be really hard to do something like that at this point. That would
Right.
definitely be a different deal. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you do have, depending on the phase you're at in your life, going rogue, depending on, what that means to the individual. It the less you have depending on you, like, a wife or a spouse or kids, the easier
Yep.
it is to roll the dice and take a chance. And, if you have to live in your car for for
Yep.
a while, it's just you, but yeah, as life progresses and you, you have a family and people and things depending on you, it does get to be a little bit trickier. But there are still ways that I want to encourage people that are listening that even if you're in that place where there's a lot of going on and it's
Yep.
scary to take some risks, but there are ways to take them in a way that you aren't putting everything at stake. So
Yep.
like maybe when you're in your 20s and 30s and or maybe not your 30s, I guess it depends on where you're at and what you've got going on, but there are ways to do it that are less extreme than perhaps you would when you are kind of just, flying solo.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Good story. And it's interesting because I always ask people, and I've had a lot of people in the medical industry, doctors and such on, and so many of them say when they were on that path and they just, for whatever reason, either a personal condition that they were trying to sort out, or for whatever reason, they decided they weren't going to continue on it, and they went rogue and went the other way. And they all said it was the best thing that they ever did. It's very interesting that how that whole, the viewpoints, the perspective, the respect that the medical industry used to garner, it's getting a little wobbly. And there's a lot of people literally, a lot of people taking their licenses off the wall and throwing them in the fire. I mean, it's an interesting time that we're in for a lot of reasons, but that's a big one right there. We'll tee that up maybe for a future conversation, but but I'm sure you have some thoughts around that as well.
I do.
Yeah, I bet. So maybe you'll agree to come back at some point and we can chat about some other things.
I will bring down property values anytime you want me to. So yes.
I love it. So before I let you go, where's the best place for people to find out more about you and what you have to offer and everything that you do for everyone?
Yeah, my main site is robbwolf.com, ROBBWOLF.com. And you can just kind of find the podcast that we do. I do a weekly podcast with my wife called The Healthy Rebellion Radio. And then over at drinkelement.com, we do a ton of material on not just electrolytes, but fasting, ketogenic diets, a whole host of things, breastfeeding and electrolytes. Like we had a whole month of deep dive on that because breastfeeding and electrolyte consumption are huge if you want to improve your odds of success on that. So yeah.
That's good to know. I wouldn't even have thought of that. That's interesting. You have a ton of great stuff out there. So you guys that are listening or watching, make sure that you do check out those sites, and we will also put those in the show notes so it's easy for people to find this stuff. You guys, this is what one of the little packages of these LMNT drinks. I mean, I'm not trying to do an ad, but I'm just saying I love this stuff. And this has really, really helped me because I was very deficient. I'm like a camel. I can drink half a glass of water and I'm good till the next day. So I know that's not good, but I've never been able to force myself to drink all this water that I've been told my entire life adult life to drink. And I was like, there's got to be something I'm missing here. This is the missing link right here. So I know there's a lot more to this, but I think that we've really done a great job explaining the fundamentals of this to people so that they can understand why this is so important and how they can remedy either their dehydration or just make sure that they're doing things in a much more optimal way. For sure. You have been amazing. Oh, I know what I wanted to ask you before I let you go. I keep saying that. Yeah. Somewhere on one of your sites, I saw some really badass looking t-shirts that say "Stay Salty." Where do I buy one of those, Rob?
Oh, we can get you. I'm not even sure if those are for sale, but I will get you one for sure.
I want one. I will pay for it, but I'm like, that is so cool. I love it. So
I'm assuming a small.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
That would be awesome. And thank you. All right. So you've been amazing, and I hope you'll come back. Everyone, make sure to check out Robb's stuff, and to find out more about coaching with me, just head on over to LoreeBischoff.com. Share the show and spread this good shift around. Give it a rating and a review, because your reviews really help inspire other people to listen to all of the good shift being shared here. So until next week, stay feisty, my friends, stay hydrated, and go make some epic shift happen in your lives. That goes for you too, Gary V.